All right, I see that attendee list growing, but we're going to go ahead and get started as others continue to join. So thank you so much for joining us for the Decolonization of Development Economics, Early Voices from the Global South discussion. This session opens a virtual symposium devoted to race, ethnicity, gender, and economic justice around the world, hosted by Yale's Economic Growth Center and Inclusion Economics Yale. I'm Catherine Cheney. I'm a reporter for DevEx focused on technology and innovation and global development. I also moderate the Yale Development Dialogues, which some of you may have seen, and I'm really thrilled to be moderating this discussion. So we'll be discussing how a pioneering group of thinkers from low and middle income countries informed the foundation of the field of development economics. We're joined by panelists who will tell us a little bit more about these economists and the legacy that they left on the field, particularly when it comes to the recognition of this interplay between race, ethnicity, gender, economic inequality, and global development. We'll have a conversation about how, particularly in this time of extreme and growing inequality, these perspectives from history can inform the future of development economics. Before I introduce all of our panelists, I'd like to introduce Rohini Pandey, Henry J. Hines II Professor of Economics and Director of the Economic Growth Center at Yale, and Gerald D. James, A. Whitney Griswold Professor of Economics and African American Studies and Urban Studies at Yale. They're going to provide a bit more context on this conversation we're having today and how it connects to the larger symposium. So, as I often say at the beginning of these kinds of conversations, why this topic? Why now? We'll start with Rohini.
Thank you, Catherine, and thank you everyone for joining. I'm very happy to welcome all of you on behalf of the Economic Growth Center. And it's the 60th anniversary of the Economic Growth Center, and we're delighted to be able to host this panel. So in the early 1950s, as the Cold War began to gain steam and colonization was ending, Ford Foundation was increasingly concerned with the idea that poverty causes conflict. They asked Lloyd Reynolds, who was then the economics department chair at Yale, to travel to Africa to study the economic aspect of this decolonization. His daughter called this trip a turning point in her father's life because it inspired him to change the focus of his work from labor to development economics. Interestingly, his first development economics research was on wages and productivity in Puerto Rican factories. And he interviewed over 1,000 workers in 85 factories. And the most striking fact of the paper he wrote was to say that worker and firm behavior was remarkably similar to what he had seen in more industrialized nations. And he directly challenged myths that low-income countries would look very different. After he came back, he went to the Ford Foundation for a year where he met Simon Kuznets. Simon Kuznets was at that point at Johns Hopkins. He was later a Nobel laureate. And he often talked about the idea that we needed a center that would focus on the comparative study of national economies. At that time, there was very little information about these newly decolonizing economies. And so Kuznets and Reynolds together ran a seminar at the National Bureau of Economic Research in 1958, which then became the basis of a proposal to the Ford Foundation for Economic Growth Center. So in December 1960, the UN General Assembly famously passed the 1514 UN resolution, which was a declaration granting independence of colonial countries to people. And very soon after that, in 1961, the Economic Growth Center was founded with a 10-year foundation grant. It then went on to become an endowed center later on. But when it started, the largest organized program it had was field study of recent economic growth in selected countries. The idea that Lloyd Reynolds as the chair put forward was that he would hire assistant professors. And in one of the early reports, it described the production cycle. Each of these men would spend 6 to 9 months in New Haven learning language skills and analytical skills. They would spend up to 2 years in the country chosen, and then on return, they would combine teaching with working material. It was certainly an extremely important way for the economics department to grow. 25 assistant professors at Yale were hired under this program. And many of them went on to be some of the first generation of development economists in US universities. Today, when I look at the history of those early years of EGC, which are very well documented through the Ford Foundation archives, some aspects have certainly not dated well. I think there were a lot of young white men who were being sent to the colonies to study them. But I think in other ways, it did identify a set of issues that perhaps development economics lost a bit of focus on along the way when it became very technocratic, which were issues of thinking of inequality, asking questions of what exactly do people in these countries, both scholars, policymakers, and others, imagine as their focus. And then I think one reason why I'm really excited to be doing this conference with Jerry is that the early focus was very much that it's a continuum of issues that range from the US to lower income countries when we think of issues of inequality, when we think of issues of how do we have process of economic growth to work for all. So I hope very much that this panel can set stage by reminding us again of what were the discussions in those early days. And with that, let me hand it over to Jerry.
Thanks, Rohini.
Well, thank you, Rohini, and welcome also to everyone. What I'd like to do is just take a few minutes to talk about what it is, at least that I think of as when I think of the phrase decolonization of development. And by that, I simply mean the right of nations to self-determination. Now, a right that's, of course, only partly won at this point, but if we consider it and what it means for those peoples who are involved, I think it floats throughout as an underlying thesis of the entire symposium that we'll be doing. So to begin with, when the Growth Center opened during 1961, let's keep in mind over 80% of the Earth's people lived on less than $1 a day. Women, especially, were engulfed in exploitation, whether they were in a wealthy or poor country, and gross illiteracy reigned globally. The Cold War dominated economic policy making worldwide, and colonial powers, who were heirs to a world economy born during a global slave trade, were reluctantly relinquishing at least their formal control over people of color across the globe. Beneficiaries of the exploitation were living in deep denial. My formal introduction to all this occurred rather coincidentally at the same time that the Growth Center was opening up, when Jean Soderstrom, the white daughter of a Republican family, told my otherwise all-white 9th grade social studies class that we were about to study for the spring contemporary independence movements. And so I began to learn a lot more about names like Gandhi and Nehru, Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, Patrice Lumumba, and Kwame Nkrumah. All leaders balancing tightropes between Cold War powers who were vying to control developing countries' resources and consumers. Now, suspicious of capitalist colonizers, the newly formed nations tried alternative paths of economic development. The marginalized economist must recognize that the demand for self-determination without abandoning rigorous thinking. She needs methodologies and models that elucidate the problems of the world, but also speak to her marginalized identity in a profession that has unfortunately been steeped in ways of thinking that often underpin her marginalization. Most adopt a premise of post-colonial studies. Colonial rulers are unreliable narrators of their subjects' conditions. Two economists whose careers exemplified this tension, who I met along my way in the early days at Yale at the Economic Growth Center, were Carlos Diaz Alejandro, an EGC colleague of 8 years, and Sir W. Arthur Lewis, with whom I co-taught during a year he visited the Economic Growth Center. I think it was 1979. Born respectively in Cuba and St. Lucia, their Caribbean origins, where slave trading and its aftermath blended people of Asia, Africa, Europe, and New World natives, creating colonized peoples who shared my status as a member of the world's marginalized population. Carlos, the Cuban refugee who loved Cuba for what it might become and not its past, shattered stereotypes of the Cuban immigrant, blindly opposed to socialism, real or imagined. He supported renewing U.S.-Cuban relations even during the Cold War. He opposed colonialist power relations throughout Latin America, and his refusal to back U.S. imperialist intrusion into Nicaragua during the 1980s are a stark revelation of the open tension that exists in the perspective of a well-trained economist familiar with both the growth potential of markets and the human rights of peoples determined to find their own voices. W. Arthur Lewis, his celebrated paper, Economic Development with Unlimited Supplies of Labor, for which he won a Nobel Prize, becoming the first and only person of African descent to do so, also exemplifies what I'm calling this post-colonial turn. His ideas of surplus labor, disguised unemployment, postulation of zero marginal product, leading to contemporary models of family utility maximization and intra-family equity, were all anathema to the neoclassical model his contemporaries were formulating. Isolate the essence of his British-style economic training, which attempts to reconcile his rational modeling with his gut-wrenching life experiences in the Caribbean and elsewhere. And we see the beginnings of an atmosphere about which his ideas might have been formed. If we throw in his experience in Britain, where he was engaged in near daily ferocious debates over politics and economic development with the likes of C.L.R. James of Jamaica and Eric Williams of Trinidad Tobago, who along with other Caribbean thinkers like Frantz Fanon of Martinique and Aimé Césaire, also of Martinique, whose discourse on colonialism and his notebook of a return to my native land, along with W.E.B. Du Bois's strivings of the Negro people, might arguably be called the foundations of the field of post-colonial studies. When we see all this and we think about that training and that experiential existence as a member of marginalized people of the world, we can think that this is the surroundings that begat Lewis's framework for discussing the reality of economic development and policy making in a multi-sector complexity.
Thank you, Jerry. And you're really setting us up for success here in terms of something I had asked all of our panelists to think about, which is, you know, our audience members might have different levels of familiarity with some of the economists who are going to come up. And I asked each of our panelists to really tell us about these people as people. Who were they? What impact did their ideas have? What challenges did they face? What legacy have they left? And that's a great preview of Arthur Lewis, and we're going to hear a little bit more in just a moment. So with that, I want to go ahead and introduce three additional panelists: Ravi Kanbur, David Engerman, and Amna Qayyum. Ravi Kanbur is a professor of economics at Cornell University. He researches and teaches in development economics, public economics, and economic theory. And some of his research and writing has explored Arthur Lewis, who you'll hear about a bit more in a moment. David Engerman is Leitner International Interdisciplinary Professor in the Department of History at Yale and the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs at Yale University. And Amna Qayyum is a postdoctoral fellow at the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs, also at Yale. Each of them have insights on how some of these early founders of development economics, Arthur Lewis and others, shaped our understanding of development. And I want to note for our audience that I certainly have a lot of questions for our panelists, but we want to make this as useful for you as possible. So please go ahead and use the Q&A function on the Zoom webinar to ask your questions throughout. And I'll ask you to keep them coming throughout, not wait until the end, so we can make this more of a conversation and get your perspectives in from the get-go. Ravi, I'd love to start with you. So as I mentioned, this was a preview that Jerry provided on Arthur Lewis. I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about his work, challenges he faced, including racism, as you've written about, and the legacy that he's left on the field.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Catherine, and my thanks to Rohini and to Jerry for the invitation. I'll pick up from where Jerry started on Arthur Lewis. Just to say that Arthur Lewis was born in 1915 in the West Indies, and he died in 1991, and then having won the Nobel Prize in 1979. So that sort of locates him in time. And as Arthur said, he was an absolutely brilliant student. As Jerry said, he's an absolutely brilliant student. Won a scholarship to the London School of Economics. And in the 1930s, he interacted with this group of radical, young black radical students, a lot of them from the West Indies. By the way, including also Paul Robeson, who at the time was at Oxford, not at the LSE. And it was that milieu. And it led to quite a radical stance on his part in the 1930s and 1940s. I think what's interesting to explore is how Arthur Lewis, over the years, became more mainstream, so to speak, and moved a little bit more to the center through his engagement with actually the decolonization process and so on. And he faced quite considerable racism in Britain. One particular thing, he was appointed to the equivalent position of assistant professor at the LSE, the first black man in history to have done so. But at the time of the appointment, the chair of the department felt, although the chair had the perfect right to make the appointment, felt he had to write to the board of governors, the trustees, in other words, of the LSE, because he said, we're going to be appointing a black man to this position. And this is at the LSE, the London School of Economics, which was founded by the great Fabian socialists, Sidney and Beatrice Webb. So if in that institution you have this going on, then you can imagine what was going on institutionally and in the rest of society. So that's just one example of these things that he faced, and he was quite radical at that time in his writings and so on. Now, quite interestingly, he had a big interaction with Ghana, and Jerry mentioned Kwame Nkrumah. Kwame Nkrumah was again a very radical leader of Ghana who led Ghana to independence, and Ghana became independent in 1957. And in March and in October 1957, Arthur Lewis arrived in Ghana as the chief economic advisor to the new government. And indeed, the reason why he was invited to do so, because the radical government of the so-called Convention People's Party, which won the election, which swept the election, thought that he would be bringing very radical perspectives, support for industrialization, support for state this and that, et cetera, et cetera. And in fact, it didn't quite turn out that way. Because although Arthur Lewis was no market fundamentalist, he was no whatever, but he actually looked at the situation on the ground. And he argued, actually in an earlier report which he'd written, that in fact Ghana should focus more on the agricultural sector, not on industrialization. Whereas what Nkrumah was pushing for was sort of rapid industrialization, big infrastructure projects, and so on and so forth. And that led to a tremendous conflict between him and Arthur Lewis. And actually, the interaction between economics and politics is also laid out very clearly in this thing. In one of the letters that Kwame Nkrumah wrote to Arthur Lewis, after Arthur had criticized him for the economic plan, he said, "The advice you have given me, sound though it may be, is essentially from the economic point of view. And I have told you on many occasions, I cannot always follow this advice, as I'm a politician and must gamble on the future." And Nkrumah very famously had said, "Seek ye the political kingdom first." And this sort of tension between what Arthur Lewis considered to be rational economic advice and the political realities on the ground is a feature of that interaction between of Arthur Lewis's work in Ghana. And he then went on actually later on. Went on later on actually to write a book called Politics in West Africa, in which he talked about this conflict. Actually, in my writings, I've sort of let me just conclude with this, Catherine. In my writings, I've sort of argued that perhaps Nkrumah had a point, that in fact, Nkrumah had to balance tremendous cleavages in Ghana across different ethnic groups, across tribes, and so on and so forth. So what may have seemed economically irrational may have been the way that he kept the whole show on the road by balancing the different interests and so on. And this tension between political realities in a society with deep cleavages and seemingly economically rational policy prescriptions is a theme that I think we should be focusing on as we think about economic policy analysis. So let me stop there, Catherine, and I'll come back with whatever later on.
Thank you. No, I just had a follow-up question for you, which perhaps I'll save so that we can bring in some other perspectives from history, but I want to come back to you on it. I just thought it was really interesting that you mentioned how Arthur Lewis moved from the radical to the mainstream, and I wanted to better understand the evolution of his thinking, but maybe we can return to that. I also really appreciate that point you concluded on, this tension between political realities and what may seem like economically rational policy prescriptions. So I hope in terms of finding a narrative thread between these different figures from history, we can understand how economic theory bumped up against reality and how that shaped this evolution of their thinking. But thank you, Ravi, that's really helpful, and we'll come back to you with some of that. So David, I know you've done research on a number of development economists who were at Cambridge University around the same time and their legacy. So can you tell us a little bit more, maybe zoom in on a few examples in terms of who were these people and what legacy have they left on the field?
Mm-hmm. That's right. Thanks, Catherine. And thanks to our organizers. I'm writing a history of development economics as told through the lives and works of 6 practitioners. All 6 were born in the early 1930s in Britain's South Asian colonies. They were too old to be Salman Rushdie's Midnight's children, born at independence in 47, 48. We might call them instead Midnight's teenagers. All 6, as you say, Catherine, came to Cambridge. At that point, certainly thought of itself as the premier department in the world and had a pretty good case for doing so. All 6 went on to greatness at national, regional, and global scales. One of them, Amartya Sen, won a Nobel Prize in economics. Another, Manmohan Singh, served a decade as Prime Minister of India. A third, Jagdish Bhagwati, is a perennial Nobel contender. A fourth, Mahbubul Haq, invented the now ubiquitous Human Development Index, actually with some help from Amartya Sen and others who I'll talk about in a second. And 2 others shaped policy and public life in Sri Lanka, that's Lal Jayawardena, and in Bangladesh, that's Rehman Sobhan, who actually worked as essentially a freedom fighter against for the independence of Bangladesh in 1971. All 6 of them, at one point or another, worked at this exact nexus of policy and economics that Ravi just raised, and we can come back to that issue as well. All of them also face this important dilemma, which is at Cambridge, they learned economics that was based almost entirely on the economic experience of the Atlantic world. But they became interested in economics initially in order to understand the world in which they were raised, what was then the Third World, now the Global South. Mahbubul Haq, as always, had a ready answer for how to handle this dilemma, even in his very first week at Cambridge. He told Amartya Sen, as the 2 of them were reflecting on their very first undergraduate lecture by the legendary Joan Robinson, Haq said that Cambridge economists were asking all the wrong questions. But instead of ignoring them, Haq told Amartya Sen, we must learn the tools of modern economics. Only then, he said, would we be taken seriously. And besides, he continued, we can use those tools to pose and answer the right questions. And certainly by their record, they did ask the right questions about the role of the state and markets in development, about how to build a newly independent nation, about the relationship between poverty and inequality, and actually about the ultimate purposes of development. What is development for? In the work I'm doing, I'm trying to write it as an embedded history of development economics. It's embedded in time and place, specifically in the Global South. And this kind of cuts against the idea raised by many historians who see development as a global North project kind of acting on the Global South. Instead, this shows how development was fundamentally actually a Global South project, from putting poverty eradication at the center of the World Bank, as Mahbubul Haq did, to the promotion of market reforms in Sri Lanka and India, as Lal Jai Warden and Manmohan Singh did, to the invention of human development. All of these have a history that's fundamentally rooted in the global South. Specifically, this is an embedded intellectual history, one that sees the field's ideas not as emerging fully formed from the minds of economists, but instead coming in response to specific practical problems, kind of the friction of theory and practice. All of these innovations in development theory and practice came actually out of efforts to solve problems. Theory doesn't descend into the world, but actually the reverse. Efforts to solve practical problems drove theoretical innovation. And finally, this is a history of development that's embedded in networks of family and friends. It focuses on the intellectual milieu in which the six scholars operated, both in their studies at Cambridge. It shows how the personal connections of these scholars shaped their work, the contacts they made with their teachers and each other at Cambridge and beyond. All six of these were part of overlapping kind of globe-spanning networks that shaped their agendas. It also touches into being embedded in what these economists learned at home, shall we say. Mahbubul Haq had two moments in the sun, one in Pakistan in 1969, and when he announced that even as a member of the Pakistan Planning Commission, denounced policies that he said countenanced and even contributed to inequality, but really relied on a decade's worth of work by his wife Khadija Haq, who had been interested in, by her own reports, the only one interested in economic inequality among the Pakistani economists. Haq's second moment in the sun, the invention of the Human Development Index and the Human Development Report in 1990, also built on networks that he had known for decades, including Amartya Sen, but also on a decade's worth of work by Khadija Haq to explore new development indicators. Other such situations are apparent for most of these scholars, which I could talk about if people are interested. I mean, I think that it shows that these embedded histories help uncover multiple vectors of power and privilege that deepen our understanding of how development ideas take shape and how they're applied. At least that's what I'm hoping to do in this work, Catherine.
Thank you, David. And yeah, I think that point is really interesting in terms of the influence that Mahbubul Haq's wife, Khadija Haq, had on his work. And yet it's hard to find much information on that, which is part of the problem and part of the value of the work that you're doing. So thank you so much. And I also thought it was fascinating that you mentioned, the value these perspectives, these early development economists bring to the field, because they want to understand the world in which they were raised. What I hope we can get to in our conversation, and again, perhaps a narrative thread connecting these different individuals, is when you said that some of these scholars were saying the wrong questions were being asked, and they wanted to use these tools to pose and answer the right questions. I want to better understand what were those questions being asked and what were those questions that they wanted asked. So hopefully we can return to that in a moment. But I want to bring Amna into this as well. So Amna, I know that your work has focused on Akhter Hameed Khan in part, who is very relevant to the discussion we're having today. So can you tell us again more about the person, the path, the legacy?
Thank you, Catherine, for the question, and thank you, the organizers, for bringing us all together to have this conversation. So as Catherine mentioned, I'm working on, so my bigger project is on intersections between global biopolitics and post-colonial development. And one aspect of it is thinking about how rural development is imagined and practiced in the 1960s. So two big points that I'd like to make, and I think this brings some of what we've been speaking about together. So firstly, I think we've been talking about the development of development economics as a social scientific field of knowledge, but I'd also like us to think about how it was shaped by actors who we wouldn't traditionally peg as economists or even academics for that matter. And to get us thinking a little bit more about the intersections between developmental practice and academic knowledge and how those inform each other in different ways. And secondly, I think I'd also like us to start thinking about the geographies of developmental thought and practice. And David mentioned these 6 economists from South Asia who converge at Cambridge and have these exciting trajectories across both the global North and the global South. But I'd also like to insert geographies from the global South as particular sites, as crucial sites actually of developmental thought, which put forward these models of developmental practice. So Akhter Hameed Khan, just a very brief biographical note. He's born in 1914 in Agra in what is present-day India. So roughly contemporaneous to Arthur Lewis. And he's not trained as a social scientist, but he's rather, in today's speak, would be a technocrat. So he worked for a little while for the Indian Civil Service under British colonial rule, where in the early 1940s, he's posted to Bengal. And in 1943, he dramatically resigns from the Indian Civil Service as a sign of protest against British colonial policies during the Bengal famine of 1943. And then for the next few years, he works as a school principal in Kamala in what is present-day Bangladesh. And then in 1958, he's appointed as a director for the newly formed Pakistan Academy of Rural Development in Kamala. So present-day Bangladesh, but what was then East Pakistan. And what he develops here is, well, today known as sort of like the Kamala model of development. And I'll speak very briefly about the model because there are many aspects to it. But it was based on cooperative, the formation of village cooperatives and participatory decision-making in which villagers would come together and decide on how to save and invest for agricultural development. There was also a focus on labor-intensive public works in which, again, the cooperative members would work together on projects such as irrigation, rural work, drainage, etc. And a lot of these, while they were drawing on older forms of, thinking about the cooperative models, what distinguished Kamala in the 1960s were two primary things. Firstly was Akhter Hameed Khan's insistence on participatory and bottom-up decision-making to mobilizing the community and its resources. And this was different from sort of earlier forms of US-led community development that were pioneered in the 1950s, which sort of inserted outsiders to sort of teach peasants how to, know how and how to practice various forms of agricultural practices. So while this was not always, we can speak more about this, it wasn't always so seamless in practice. In theory, what was conceptualized was sort of two ways, sharing of knowledge and a learning process in which peasants were leading their community's development. And secondly, what made Akhter Hameed Khan's thinking and the project of Kamala interesting was its focus early on, from the early 1960s, on women and the household as what they called not as objects of development, but as active agents of their own development. So while we were seeing quite a lot of focus in the 1960s on, development as spectacle, and as Rabi mentioned in Ghana, there was a lot of focus on, industrialization. So, the steel mill or the dam or what have you, and this was being replicated in a lot of other post-colonial countries as well. What the model at Kamala did was to focus also on social norms, gender norms, and reproductive practices as aspects of developmental thinking and practice. So through both sort of sociological knowledge that was being produced at Kamala and the projects that were being pioneered, women were slowly incorporated into developmental thinking as key actors. And not just actors through, whose reproduction must be controlled, although that was a big part of it, and I can speak more about it if anyone's interested, but also as economic agents who required technical and vocational training. So I think in this way, Kamala also provides an early glimpse into the ways in which women were slowly being linked into economic development and thought in practice. And this would later forcefully, I think, inform academic knowledge in development economics as a field in what is today known as the women in development approaches in the 1970s, which really came to the fore in global consciousness at that point, with feminist economists such as Devki Jain and Esther Boserup. They were forcefully theorizing the links between economic productivity, development, and gender. But I think focusing on Kamala provides us an interesting glimpse into not just how, academic theory affects practice, but how developmental practice informs the formation of development economics as a field.
Thank you, Amna. And I think your question has inspired, or sorry, your remarks have inspired a great question from our audience, which is also a question that I wanted to pose. So you talked a lot about Akhter Hameed Khan's impact on development, including this participatory decision-making, as well as women as agents of development. Staying on that theme of women for a moment, and specifically women in development economics, one of our attendees asks, could the panelists shed light on the missing mothers of development economics? Why do we value less the work of Joan Robinson, Krishna Bharadwaj, and others relative to their male counterparts? So Joan Robinson came up earlier, and I think that's a great question, and actually one I was hoping to pose as well as a follow-up. Ravi, is that something you could tell us a little bit more about?
Sure, I can say a few words. And David said that was the first lecture that Amartya and Mahbub went to was Joan Robinson's lecture. Now, Joan Robinson, she was born in 1903 and died in 1983. So I suppose in the 50s she would have been in her 50s at the time. As an undergraduate in Cambridge myself, she was a presence up there, so to speak. But then, as a young faculty member at Cambridge, as the equivalent of assistant professor at Cambridge, again she was very much a presence in the common room, in the faculty room, arguing and debating and so on. Now, Joan Robinson is actually known for at least two things in economics. One is her contribution to economic theory, in particular her analysis in the 1930s of monopoly. And in fact, she coined the word monopsony, which is where the buyer of a product has power. Monopoly is where the seller of a product has power. Monopsony is where the buyer of a product has power. And the key product for where the buyer may have power is, of course, labor. And we're seeing now with platforms and so on and so forth, the whole question of monopsony, the power that buyers have of labor, has come to the fore. And it was Joan Robinson who actually did the first rigorous analysis of this back in the 1930s. And there are other major contributions she made to economic theory at the time. But relevant to this discussion, she also was very much engaged in development questions, in questions of economic development. And two things I would point out. In the 1970s, she became very closely engaged with a great Indian economist. He wasn't at Cambridge at the time, David. He was an earlier generation. He was at the LSE. His name was K.N. Raj, who founded something called the Center for Development Studies in Kerala, and was in fact part of developing the so-called Kerala model of sort of social expenditures, attention to women's development, and so on and so forth. And it was in conjunction with the left-led governments which dominated Kerala for a long time. That, if you like, that was the economic wing of that whole development. And Joan Robinson had a very close relationship with K.N. Raj, and she would visit the Center for Development Studies in Trivandrum on a very regular basis and engage with policymakers and so on at the time. So that is one area. The other area where I think perhaps we can have more questions about her is that she actually in the 1960s engaged a lot with the developments in China and with the Cultural Revolution and North Korea and so on. And the argument is that she was too uncritical of the developments that were going on in the Cultural Revolution, and also actually in North Korea, where she gave glowing reports of developments in North Korea. And so there's been a debate and a discussion on that in the literature, harking back to people in the 1930s who went to the Soviet Union and didn't see below the surface, etc. So she's an absolute giant in our field, and in my view, for her contributions to economics, she should have won the Nobel Prize, plain and simple. No question about it at all.
So Ravi, as you mentioned, she is a giant in the field, and this question from the audience is, why is her work perhaps valued less than the work of some of her male counterparts? Or perhaps put another way, why didn't she win the Nobel Prize? Is this something, perhaps Rohini, that you want to comment on, just in terms of connecting this to some of the broader themes of this symposium?
Oh, Happy to do so. Let me, I recently wrote a piece on, in fact, the starter of perhaps the Cambridge School of Economics, Alfred Marshall, and his extreme misogyny, where he was very opposed to women getting degrees, but also seemed to have made very great use of his wife, Mary Pilly Marshall's great talents as an economist. She actually was a co-author on a book with him on the economics of industry, which preceded the famous Principles of Economics, and Marshall very explicitly sought to keep it out of print once his book was published. But what I wanted to go with that is and as David, in fact, helped me realize, Cambridge economists wrote very detailed letters to each other, notes, and they're all archived. I got an email from a young undergraduate at Yale who had just finished last year. She was one of the top students of her year, saying, oh, I read something, and I'll read it out in a second, footnote 19, and this is something I heard all the time from my contemporaries at Yale. And so the quote was from Marshall, who described, he put forward a set of arguments to the Cambridge Senate on why women shouldn't do economics. And one of them was, he said, while he felt the questions asked by women generally relate to lecture or bookwork, or else to practical problems such as poor relief, men who have attended fewer lectures, read fewer books, and perhaps likely to obtain less marks in examinations are more apt to ask questions showing mental initiative and giving promise of original work in the future. And she felt she was always at Yale put into the category of the industrious girl who came at the top of her class, but perhaps was not asking the smartest questions. So to link that back to what Ravi said and why many women didn't get credit, I think that's part of it. So if you look through the long arc of history, as Ravi said, Joan Robinson identified monopsony. Another person whose name came up earlier was Beatrice Webb. She's the person who identified the word collective bargaining in her book on the theory of cooperatives, which was another book that Marshall actively told her not to write because he told her she should focus on women's problems, not on collective bargaining. And so, I think perhaps a very poignant example of what happened to many of these women and what continues on is actually in a letter that Alfred Marshall's wife, Mary Pilly Marshall, wrote to Joan Robinson in the 1930s when her book on monopsony came out. She was also the godmother to Joan Robinson's daughter, and she wrote, "Thank you for helping lift off the reproach cast on the economic woman." And I think, this is something that we hear about when it comes to race, when it comes to gender, that the canons of economics were often written not just with the notion of someone who doesn't really exist, but also by someone who had a very strong notion of what work should be canonized. And I think we are still seeing the aftermath of that, not just in women or kind of economists from the global south or members of certain social groups not getting the recognition they should. But I think even more broadly than that, a narrowing of the questions that we are asking in development economics or in economics more generally.
Absolutely. Thanks, Rohini. And we have some great questions coming in. It's actually hard to choose, which is a good position to be in, but keep them coming. I want to start with this question, which I thought was a great one, in part because it's sort of looking ahead and where do we go from here? So this is an attendee saying, a lot of ideas on the decolonization of development economics can be found in journals produced in developing countries, which are not given prominence in the wider world. What can be done to harness these ideas in the field of development economics? So let's say there are economists right now who, 50 years from now, there will be a webinar discussing their legacy, but perhaps much of their writing is not getting the kind of attention that it should globally. So what can be done to change that? Thoughts on that question? And if not, plenty others are rolling in, but go ahead, Ravi.
Well, so let me perhaps take a a somewhat more positive, forward-looking approach to this, and say that, you know, if we go back to the time of Joan Robinson and so on, there really was only Cambridge, if you see what I mean, in terms of economics. There was very little in the way of general communication and so on and so forth, and it was very restricted channels of communication. The economic journal was a preserve of a few people, and so on. And I think what gives hope is that situation has changed because of new technology and so on and so forth. So in fact, that some of the perspectives that one would have lost 60, 70 years ago, at least there's a prospect that they will be brought to the center stage. That's what I would say. There's of course always the issue in all academic things, and we have a bunch of academics here, in terms of the reification of certain journals and certain whatever. But that's the academic frame. Yeah.
Thanks, Bobby. Amna, do you want to jump in?
Yes, I think we also need to think about the terms of engagement in which, well, just to use the catch-all phrase, the global south is engaging, is being engaged with when it comes to the field of economics, and many other academic fields where sort of, well, to use the word shorthand, local scholars are seen as sort of research assistants or information gatherers, and their insights aren't seen as being theoretically sound enough to actually, they're just there for giving us sort of local knowledge and practice. And then it's someone who's sitting in the global north who will, you know, fantastically come up with all these great ideas. So I think maybe just smaller things like co-authorship might be a good way forward in recognizing that it's in sort of trying to make it a little bit less hierarchical in terms of how knowledge is being produced.
Thanks on that. I want to go to another great question here. So someone asks, if one wants to decolonize development, then it cannot simply be about a different kind of person engaging in development. So we've been talking a lot about, you know, who these thinkers were and are, and the importance of diversity. But this person adds, it must be about using the tools, institutional power, and methods to create decolonization. So the question is, can you distinguish the thinkers some of you have brought up by clarifying which ones sought development of the same old type and which ones sought actual decolonization? So this gets a little bit deeper into the work, the questions they were posing, the work they were doing, and to what extent decolonization of development, not just the field of development economics, was part of their legacy. So maybe our panelists want to jump in and shed a bit more light on the people you talked about in that sense. I thought it was a great question. David?
It is a great question. I feel like for the six who I'm looking at, they are kind of all over the map on this one. So two of them win remarkable accolades in the Academy of the Global North by Guati and Sen. I asked Sen where he learned his development economics, and he said there actually is no such thing as development economics, there's only economics. And so clearly that his move is decolonizing in some ways and not in others. One of the things that struck me is how most of them, most of the people who I'm looking at, got really deeply engaged and devoted tremendous energies to working in international institutions and to creating those institutions. So Manmohan Singh, for instance, who's often thought of as rightly thought of as one of the innovators in liberalizing the Indian economy in 1991, his prior job was actually working for the socialist leader of Tanzania, former leader of Tanzania, Julius Nyerere, in a project called the South Commission, which was to create a think tank and a kind of nexus for intellectual political life by and for the global South. A number of the people I'm looking at worked at UN agencies at one point or another. Mahbubul Haq and Khadija Haq together created a series of smaller, more ephemeral organizations. And so they were very active, I think, and devoted extensive energy to institution building or working within institutions to redirect them. And so I think that's one of the places that we can see it. It's actually requires perhaps leaving the academy, or at least in the cases I'm looking at, those who stuck in the academy tended to be doing conventional economics brilliantly well, but not rethinking all of the premises along the dimensions that we're talking about here.
Very interesting point, and partly because perhaps while remaining in the world of academia, those theories and concepts weren't bumping up against realities that can change your thinking. Other thoughts from our panelists in response to this great question? Otherwise, we have others coming in, but Amna, did you want to say something on this?
Yeah, I'll just have, Sheetal, this is such a great question, and I think it requires a lot more thought and explication. But what I will say, I think and I think Ravi also mentioned this, is that a lot of the thinkers that we're looking at, they're bumping up against politics. And in many instances, they're working with authoritarian regimes. So in my case, Akhter Hameed Khan is working with Ayub Khan. Mahbubul Haq, as David mentioned, is also an advisor in Ayub Khan's regime. So while they're having conflicts, I think they're more wedded to ideas of post-colonial development than decolonization. If we were to think about decolonization as a project of self-determination, maybe someone like Rahman Subhan, who David looks at and who is termed as a freedom fighter in the liberation of Bangladesh. I think maybe if we focus on him, we can think more about decolonization, but I think some of the examples that we've given, there's definitely a link between post-colonial development, authoritarianism, and development economics as a field.
Thanks, Amna. As we have more questions coming in, I want to return to a couple things that were said that I think might help build some connections between these people who've been brought up. So David, it actually starts with something you mentioned, that some of the economists you're focused on who were together at Cambridge during the same time talked about how the wrong questions were being asked, and they wanted to change the nature of the conversation and pose and answer the right questions. So can you expand in a little more detail on what you mean by that?
Well, I would just take for starters, one of the questions they all were engaged with in different ways at different times was inequality. And here, you can look at this in two different dimensions, at a kind of domestic level and at an international level. And so at the domestic level, we're talking in a moment where inequality is seen as a perhaps unfortunate in some cases, but always necessary byproduct of economic growth that would sort of solve itself. This is the famous Kuznets curve from Simon Kuznets, who Rohini mentioned. Whereas I think we find in all of these scholars a determination, even though they had different prescriptions, shall we say, determination to address questions of economic inequality at the domestic level. Amartya Sen, I think in particular, was focused on the intersection, especially in his later work, the intersection of economic inequality and other structures of domestic inequality, caste and gender among them. At the second level of global economic power, it was too easy for, I think, for economists just to think of the world as made up of nations with equal rights and therefore perhaps equal entry points into the global economy. Whereas I think people like Jagdish Bhagwati, Manmohan Singh, Lal Jayawardena were very focused on the nuts and bolts of global economic inequality and worked. Bhagwati stayed mostly in academia, but Singh and Jayawardena worked in the trenches at the IMF, actually, at the UN Conference for Trade and Development, at the South Commission, to try and find ways to address, to redress global economic inequality. So those are, if I had one question, that would be it, albeit in two parts.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you. I want to bring in another question from the audience, actually two questions related to Arthur Lewis. And so perhaps Ravi or Jerry want to jump in on this. Here are the two questions. The first is, in relation to the tension between economics and politics, which has come up a few times, would you say that Arthur Lewis covered aspects of this in his book, Theory of Economic Growth? That's one question. And then the other, which I'll throw in, when teaching, I would tell students that Arthur Lewis never claimed the marginal product of labor was zero. He argued that in non-capitalist sectors, the marginal product of a laborer could be zero if compensated by greater effort by the rest of the household unit. Why was that insight so often misunderstood? So 2 questions directly pointed at our Arthur Lewis experts here. And I wonder if you can react to those and perhaps even shed a little bit more light about Arthur Lewis and his legacy in doing so. So Ravi or Jerry, who wants to jump in first? Ravi?
Jerry, why don't you go first, then I'll follow up. You're muted.
I was thinking that this was more in your bailiwick, and you should go first. So please do.
Yeah. Sure. So the answer to the first question, actually, I don't think the theory of economic growth was directed to that sort of question of the intricate interaction between politics and economics and so on. In fact, it was Lewis's Politics in West Africa which sort of took head on the question of the and he was criticized for a lot of his theorizing and that and his analysis and that, but it was his attempt to make sense of what he had seen in the thing. So just another little quote from Lewis. He's talking about the development plan in 1957 and 1958, and this was the exchange with Nkrumah, which basically led to him resigning as an advisor. He says, "It is not easy to make good development plan, make a good development plan for £100 million if the Prime Minister insists on inserting £18 million of his own pet schemes of a sort which neither develop the country nor increase the comfort of the people." Okay? And that's a very sort of technocratic economist type perspective. And of course, Nkrumah's response was, the reason why the whole show is on the road is because of these £18 million that I'm using in this way or that way to keep different groups happy. And I guess we certainly I as an economist haven't resolved that that tension in my mind at all. So that was that point. And then the second point is a much more technical point. So I'm not sure we should necessarily get into it in great detail.
It is quite technical.
But it's a great point. And actually, going back to one of David's 6, Amartya Sen actually had quite a well-known paper. I believe it was in the Journal of Political Economy, where he made precisely this, where he formalized this point precisely, that actually it might look to you as though there's unlimited supply of labor, but actually other members of the household are adjusting their labor supply to keep everything as it is. And guess who's actually adjusting the labor supply when a man leaves for the city?
Thank you, Ravi. Jerry, anything you want to add on that in terms of Arthur Lewis?
Well, in terms of Arthur Lewis, the one thing I would say is that when he was still in his 40s, when he was dealing with Ghana and Kwame Nkrumah, and that one of the characteristics of Arthur Lewis that I discovered was that even on important questions, he was willing, at least later in his life, to change his mind. And I think that in some conversations I had with him, but even more importantly, in some formal lectures that I heard him give, he had mellowed a bit from what we might call a younger man in his 40s, sort of hardcore, technical, this is the economist and these politics shouldn't be getting in the way.
That kind of gets back to something Ravi was mentioning earlier in terms of the evolution of his thinking. So I appreciate that we were able to go into that in a little bit more depth. We have some other great questions coming in. Keep them coming. Now, some of them are bringing up other, early thinkers in development economics who perhaps should also be part of this conversation, people from around the world who have contributed to the field. I guess it points to the importance of having a conversation like this because we don't talk about these individuals enough. But again, just trying to build a connection between the people you all are focused on in your research. This is one of the questions posed in the description of this webinar. We talked about what set the stage for this pioneering group of thinkers to define development. And I guess I will ask that, but I want to broaden that a little bit. So what was the context that allowed these thinkers to make an impact on the field of development? And what were some of the very real challenges that stood in the way of them being able to make the impact they could have? So we've talked about people who have been recognized and received awards for really their contributions to the field, but also people who maybe didn't get the recognition they should have. And there are many other names who aren't a part of this webinar. So I just wonder if any of you can talk a little bit more about not just the people, but the context around them, including issues like racism, sexism, that, you know, what were the conditions that set them up to make a difference in the field, and what were some of the constraints that held them back?
I would say that the overriding precondition for it is the sort of partial and uneven decolonization, which provided new forms of independence, especially obviously political independence, but also created reconstructed and reconfigured forms of economic dependence. It admitted people born colonial subjects into the highest citadels of Western learning in the 1950s, especially in the US, in the United Kingdom, by the 1960s, increasingly in the United States, but also presented them with kind of constraints and uneven treatment. I actually asked a number of people who, well, of these six, as well as people who studied with them in the 1950s who were from South Asia. And almost to a person, they deny that they were treated any differently in this time. But you also get sort of a counter narrative. The widow of one of them told me that Amartya Sen and Laljaya Wardner used to get confused all the time. Like people would confuse one for the other, even though they look remarkably different. Amartya Sen is sort of tall and rail thin, angular face, and Laljaya Wardner completely different, and yet they were constantly confused. Amartya Sen even told me that he faced no discrimination. He said either for or against on the basis of his South Asian descent. And so this unevenness, I think, is really important. It removes some important inequalities, but left in place or even reinforced other kinds of at a kind of more structural level about forms of inequality. So I would say that sort of the incompleteness of decolonization, it was a long process. It was and an incredibly uneven process that all of these people are entering into.
Thanks, David. Amna, anything to add in terms of Akhter Hameed Khan and the constraints, the context, both opportunities and constraints in terms of his ability to really leave a legacy?
Yeah, so I actually think, David, uneven decolonization is such a good way to, I think, sort of think about the period, the 50s and the 60s that we're all, I think, sort of collectively thinking about. Because while some hierarchies, global hierarchies, might have sort of been, reconceptualized, new hierarchies were created, even within the post-colonial nation state. So I think, so for Akhter Hameed Khan, I think the Cold War geopolitical context is extremely important. So while older forms of colonial knowledge about development were still in play, but there were these new forms of knowledge that were also being created. So if we look at Pakistan as an example, I think we can't discount sort of the co-creation of academic knowledge in so many different fields, which was, at many times funded by, as even Rohini mentioned in the introduction, the Ford Foundation and particular institutes such as the Economic Growth Center. So for Akhter Hameed Khan, his trajectory in the 1960s was he kept bumping up against Ayub Khan's authoritarian regime. And by sort of, the traditional account is in 1971, he's sort of forced to flee Kamala because of the Bangladesh War of Liberation. But since the late 1960s, you can sort of see that the state is, Ayub Khan's state is getting more insistent on putting forward more status programs of development in Kamala, where Akhter Hameed Khan then regularly has disagreements and sort of, threatens to resign. He does resign for a while, then he's sort of reinstated. So I think, but then he's also backed by the Ford Foundation advisors. So there's all these sort of Cold War geopolitical tensions that really, and the alignments with an authoritarian regime that really sort of make this project really messy. And once sort of, Bangladesh becomes independent, then whatever the legacy of Kamala was is then reimagined in new ways. And it does inform in the 1980s some of the microcredit approaches that are then pioneered in Bangladesh. But it's a story of where politics frequently rubs up against what the development economics or practitioners have in mind.
Thank you, Amna. I want to bring in another question from the audience. There are a few questions around early thinkers in development economics from Latin America. And that might not necessarily be the focus in terms of our panelists' expertise, but just questions around these early thinkers from Latin America perhaps being missing from this discussion. And I think one of the interesting points that came up is how much of this work was originally in Spanish and sometimes lost in translation to English, which is perhaps a challenge globally when we talk about great thinking in development economics happening from different countries where English is not the primary language. So I just want to kind of throw that out there, whether you want to talk about Latin America specifically or this challenge of language and translation. I just think it's an important point to bring up. Any reactions from our panelists? David?
I mean, I agree with the thrust of the critique that we're leaving out Latin America here. I think in some part, this is a kind of conceptual sense of the time that the kind of the action, if you will, was in newly independent nations, and so the Caribbean gained independence where Lewis and others are from only in the 1960s, but most of the rest of continental Central and South America were already independent. So if decolonization is a name, it sort of leaves out this. I think the work that Raul Prebisch and many others did at the Economic Commission for Latin America is crucial. What's striking to me, and I've often found this puzzling, is how little the South Asian economists connected with Latin Americans, either personally or engaging in, or even just in print. That there's this really strong disconnect in the 50s and well into the 1960s between these two sets of brilliant economists in both sides working independently on many of the same questions. And I think one of the questions we might ask is what's responsible for that sort of barrier or missed connection, if you will.
Yeah, great point. I'm glad you brought that up. Ravi, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, just a little nugget of just an observation. Arthur Lewis, after he left Ghana, went to only came back once, and that was in 1963 for a conference on the 7-year plan, Ghana's 7-year plan. And here are some of the people who were actually present at the discussion of that 7-year plan. It's Albert Hirschman, Nicholas Caldo, Osvaldo Sonko, and Ken Raj, the person I mentioned earlier as being very, very important. So, the point is, I think the occasions for these people to meet and discuss were few and far between, I think, because this is the 1960s and so on, and travel and so on and so forth. And the creation of these UN, the Economic Commission for Asia and the Far East, which was ECAFE at the time, it's now ESCAP, Economic and Social Commission for Asia and Pacific, and then ECLAC in Latin America, etc. In some sense, I suppose segmented the discourse in that way, and it's not difficult to imagine that it was difficult for actual get-togethers in that time. But here's one small example where they all came to assess Ghana's plan from Latin America, from India, and so on.
Very interesting, and kind of echoing your point earlier, when there was this question about academic journals, at least a point of optimism is sharing work across geographies is easier today than it was at that time for scholars to be able to come together despite distance. I want to get to this great question from the audience. and it points to something that I was hoping to get to in our conversation. One of the things I wanted to really make sure we talk about is, how are these figures that we've talked about from history continuing to inform development research, policy, and practice? And some of you alluded to that in your remarks. But here's a specific question on their legacy today. So this comes from the audience. Thinking about the turn towards poverty reduction and away from an earlier era of focus on addressing global inequality, how did these economists relate to this turn? What role did they play in it? David?
I can start with it. I mean, at an institutional level, the World Bank, then and I suppose now probably still the largest single institution in the kind of development landscape, their turn toward poverty eradication came primarily through the efforts of Mahbubul Haq, who convinced a sort of dynamic new World Bank president, perhaps doing penance for his leading the Vietnam War for the 1960s, Robert McNamara, to push, to sort of change the focus at an institutional level of the world toward poverty reduction. And I also think that, sticking with Haq for a second, there's a sort of the focus on human development helps us really understand the rise of NGOs on the one hand, which were well equipped to handle questions like health and education, which were kind of factored into human development beyond just national income. And so we can see in this, I wouldn't say that Haq kind of predicted or made this happen, but it was consonant with a move away from big national institutions toward international NGOs and even regional and local NGOs, taking on smaller scale projects rather than just advising national governments and on their national plans.
Really interesting. That's a world I cover closely. And honestly, I was not as familiar with his influence on the development of really the whole NGO sector. So really interesting. Other thoughts in terms of more broadly how these figures that we focused on today continue to affect development economics, development policy, and this turn away from addressing global inequality towards poverty reduction, which perhaps some might argue may turn again toward addressing global inequality, given some of the issues we're seeing. Sherry, did you want to jump in on that?
Yeah, but just a small point. Let's not forget that reducing poverty is reducing global inequality. And in fact, if one were thinking about what is the quickest way in the short run that I could try to reduce global inequality, would be to try to reduce poverty. One way of thinking about this is that, because there was also an earlier question about the Reines-Fay formalization of Lewis's model, which ignored various issues having to do with inequality and things like that. One way of thinking about that is those are models and ways of thinking that are looking at policies and issues and their long-run effects, as opposed to thinking about the short-term effects of policies and trying to do something in the short term. And I think that this turn that's being talked about towards poverty reduction, which is kind of getting at the more micro level of where individual people are or individual communities are in fact thinking about, I want to do something about poverty in the next 5 years, or I want to change global inequality, even though it may not be some huge change in the short run. So I think we have to put those questions into some kind of perspective.
Thanks, Jerry. Other thoughts on this? Otherwise, a couple more questions really. And Ravi.
Yeah, I suppose just reacting a little bit to Jerry's point, I suppose the concern might be that what if the causality runs from global inequality to poverty in individual countries? I suppose that's the nature of the thing. So I suppose in an accounting sense, if I reduce poverty in a country, then almost by definition, global inequality as measured will reduce. But does the global inequality in some sense, does it have the seeds of the structural processes which lead to poverty in this country? So that would be the. Now, Arthur Lewis, again, going back to Arthur Lewis, he had some his sort of surplus labor theory actually also helped him understand, he says, global inequalities. So he has this phrase where he says, when I look at plantations, he says, there's been tremendous technical progress in efficiency gains in the production of plantation crops over the last 100 years or whatever. And yet, he said, I remember the phrase, he says, plantation workers are bare feet and wear rags, something like that, he said. The question is why? It's because their wages are held down by this unlimited supply of labor that's coming in from the countryside. So all the gains of technical progress are actually going to the owners of the plantation, not to the workers. It's when that surplus labor phase ends, and wages start rising, labor markets tighten. That's when you start going to get the good effects on inequality of the technical change. And of course, if one looks at China's development, just to bring it to a contemporary frame, that would be one argument as to why it is that inequality rose so sharply in the Chinese context, because there's this massive supply of, so to speak, surplus labor coming in from rural areas, essentially holding wages lower than they otherwise would have been. And it was only really when the so-called Lewis turning point was reached, when the labor market started tightening in rural areas, that wages started rising in rural areas, that maybe some positive effects on the reduction of inequality started coming through. So that, if you like, is a translation of the Lewisian perspective from the 1950s to the current Chinese discourse. Some of us have been arguing that maybe Chinese inequality, at least, is not increasing at the rate that it was, and one of the arguments is that that the Lewis turning point, so to speak, has been reached.
So I want to give enough time and space to throw out one final question. And given the complexity of what we're discussing, I want to make sure that each of our speakers have really a couple minutes for any final thoughts. But first, I want to bring in what's a comment from the audience that I think is highly relevant. The comment is, it would be great if the idea of decolonization transcended the list of early greats in development economics to encompass the new understandings of the term that have emerged among people working in the global South today. So I think really that comment is connecting this conversation we're having in the opening session, talking about these early thinkers who influenced the field of development economics, to the themes of the symposium that will continue Friday, October 29th, as well as Friday, November 5th. So again, the point is, how do we talk not only about these early greats and the legacy they left, but new understandings of the term of the decolonization of development economics, especially for people working in low and middle income countries today. And so to turn that into the form of a question and really give each of you a little bit of time to connect the people you talked about with the themes of this symposium, do you have any final thoughts on the importance of considering these early voices as we gear up for the symposium focused on race, ethnicity, gender, economic justice, and global development? And we'll start with David, Ravi, and Amna, and then I'd love to close with Rohini and Jerry and help connect this opening session to the larger symposium. David, can we start with you?
I was afraid you were going to say that, Catherine. It's a really big question. I'm not exactly sure how to take it. I mean, I do think that the question of inequality that was so important to these figures really remains a central question, a question today, and that was the right question that they were asking. I might actually add to it something that's come up a little bit, I guess, obliquely, particularly in some of Ravi's comments, which is a kind of, I guess, temporal inequality. One of the things that the scholars I'm writing about were focused on was consumption now versus consumption later, right? And the idea would be that what sort of sacrifices now will provide goods later. Joan Robinson perhaps typically had a great sentence about that when she visited Sri Lanka in the late 1950s and saw this robust welfare state, social welfare state, that she said that Sri Lanka was eating the fruit before growing the tree, that it was spending rather than saving for the short term. And so I think one of the issues that we see people like Amartya Sen deal with in academic and formal language, and we see others like Mahbubul Haq deal with in a kind of more political vein, is this other dimension of inequality, which is how do you balance the current against the future. And it's plausible to think that with our current interest in global inequality, certainly since 2008, even just in economic terms, that becomes central. I would say that this group, for all of their insights, the ones who I'm looking at, were not necessarily the right ones to look at the interface of structures of economic inequality with other structures of inequality. And it's too kind of vexing a question to answer directly right now. But I would say that when you ask economists to talk about inequality, it's not a surprise that they turn to economic inequality. And so perhaps the message is one of Amna's about bringing in people working on boundary, on the boundaries or economics and its neighbors as a way to kind of continue this process moving forward.
Thanks, David. Amna, can I bring you in next?
Sure. Actually, David, that's a great segue for me. So one of the things I was going to say is that the Kamala model obviously has its critiques and problems, but the one thing that it was doing was that it was interdisciplinary in nature, right? So it wasn't just economists who were producing knowledge, but it was also anthropologists, sociologists, and political scientists who were there. And really, like, they were living in Kamala, they were going out into the communities and working with people and producing these forms of knowledge. So I think maybe focusing a little bit more and taking more seriously local knowledges and practices, and then also broadening our visions of what the political economy is, to really bring reproductive practices, to bring the family into focus when we think about political economy. And it's not just about rational economic agents. I think that might be ways of, some things we should be thinking about as we move forward with economic justice. And maybe one last point, when thinking again about a lot of these development projects and where the funding's coming from, is to think more seriously about what are the power structures in place, and who gets to benefit the most from these forms of expertise and funding. And so just being more attentive to funding flows as well.
Great point. Thanks, Amna. Ravi.
Yeah, so let me just say, I agree with all the things that have been said on this thing, and just speaking as an economist, economics has a lot of strengths, but also a lot of weaknesses. And I say, perhaps the greatest weakness is that economists don't know the weaknesses of their discipline. They focus a lot on the strengths, and there are a lot of strengths, no question about it. So I would say that, for example, that we don't engage with history. We don't engage with actually the history of our own discipline, let alone history more generally. And that's what we've been seeing, that there are real insights to be had by going back and seeing what these greats, how they interacted with the world and so on. And the second thing that we tend not to do is to interact with other disciplines too much. And I think what this discussion has, what Amna was saying and others, really that engagement, I think, is not only leads to good policy making and so on, but it also actually leads to good economics, defined in its own terms. So let me leave it at that.
Agreed. And that's part of why I'm so grateful that Rohini and Jerry have brought us together, because it's addressing some of those problems you just articulated. This discipline not engaging with its own history enough, and not engaging enough with other disciplines. And I think this opening session of the symposium and the whole symposium will be really valuable from that perspective. So Rohini, Jerry, you kind of kicked us off in terms of why this conversation, why now, and would love just any final reflections from the two of you, and maybe connecting this conversation that we're having today to the larger symposium. Jerry, you want to start?
Okay, well, just very briefly, I think that the last comments that were made kind of would take us back to, I think David was talking about someone among his six who mentioned that at Cambridge, the economists back in the, I guess the 40s or 50s weren't asking the right questions. Well, or at least they weren't asking all the right questions. And that's where I think the rest of the symposium is going to be trying to go. We've tried to bring together people who are asking questions that are somewhat different from what we're usually going to see in economics journals. And part of the reason for that, I would say, which connects to David's point and the one that Robbie just made, as well as Amna, is that one gets rewards in the economics profession by publishing in certain kinds of journals, and you publish in certain kinds of journals on the basis of methodological sophistication. So when you start asking why aren't economists interfacing with economic history and with anthropologists or political scientists more, that kind of is already your answer. You're going to be posing questions that are broader than the ones that can just solely be answered with the kinds of methodological tools that are going to get you published in these journals. So we're kind of interested in asking some of these broader questions and asking what methodological means can we use to approach those questions. So I hope that the people who were here with us today can continue with us to get some of those answers.
Thank you, Jerry. Rohini, we'll go to you.
Thanks. I don't think I have much to add. The one last point I'd probably add, and maybe this goes back to the discussion of where did the inequality discussion go in development, is that we're also hoping to, in a lot of ways, not silo development. I mean, development was a very odd product. As a discipline, was a very odd product. It was defined by the end of colonialism, and most fields in economics are not defined by country. They're defined by, for instance, you're thinking about labor economics, you're thinking about issues in public economics. And today, the field of development in some ways is perhaps killed by its own success, in that it, if you're talking about issues of, say, affirmative action and inequality, those conversations should be happening across people thinking about them in the US, in Malaysia, in India. And yet sometimes that gets very siloed. Issues of inequality need to be dealt by thinking about tax systems and public finance. But that's, if you look at the public finance literature, that's usually a very US focused literature in economics. So I think one thing that I would love to see come out over the next few years as we broaden these conversations is really to say that when we ask these questions, we shouldn't really think about it, oh, it's development because it's talking about Nigeria, and it's not development because it's talking about the US or UK, but rather think about what the question is. And I hope that this conference gets us started on that.
Thanks, Rohini. Great points. So that concludes this opening session of the symposium. And again, this is just the beginning of a virtual symposium devoted to race, ethnicity, gender, and economic justice around the world, hosted by Yale's Economic Growth Center and Inclusion Economics Yale. It will continue on Friday, October 29th and Friday, November 5th, with researchers presenting on the costs of discrimination based on race, ethnicity, and gender, and paths to economic justice. You can see information on registration here in Zoom if you're joining us live. We really appreciate all of you in the audience for taking the time to tune in. Thanks for your great questions. Look forward to continuing the conversation during the symposium, and thanks again to our panelists.